What's the best RC control link for you to use? I don't mean the radio itself. I mean the RC control link. Is it the FrSky ACCST protocol or FrSky ACCESS protocol that's built into a lot of the radios that most of us already own? Or is it one of these more advanced protocols like TBS Crossfire, TBS Tracer, ImmersionRC Ghost, ExpressLRS, or yes, even FrSky R9? That is what I'm going to try to accomplish in this video. I'm going to try to run down the major factors for each of these different types of control links that would steer you towards one or away from it and help you decide, if you're still on the fence, which one of these is the best one for you. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. One of the most important lessons for me as a YouTube content creator has been that if you go into a video expecting one thing and you get something else, no matter how good the something else is, you're going to be unhappy. So I want to set your expectations right here at the beginning. This video is not a great big long-range shootout. It's not a latency shootout. All of those things have already been done by other people. And I have been talking to those people for the last more than a month. I've actually been working on this video for a long time because frankly, almost all of these control protocols are really freaking good. Almost all of them are more than most people are going to need, which means when it comes time to pick which one is the right one for you, in a certain sense, any of them could be good. But I have identified some characteristics that I think would steer you one way or the other, and I'm going to tell you what they are. And the first protocol that we're going to talk about is FrSky ACCST. If you have ever bound a FrSky receiver in D16 mode, you were using the FrSky ACCST protocol. And the number one thing that ACCST has going for it is that it is just so common. So ACC is baked into basically all FrSky radios that you buy today. And in addition, it's built into lots of third-party radios like this Radiomaster TX16S. In addition to being built into lots of radios, most bind and fly quadcopters can be purchased with a FrSky ACCST compatible receiver. As far as range goes, ACCST radios can typically get between about 1 and 2 kilometers under ideal conditions. Under extraordinary conditions, like with external antennas, they can go further. And under realistic conditions, where you're going to have trees and buildings and obstacles, that range is going to come down significantly. It's pretty common if you're flying in really difficult environments like a concrete bando to failsafe a FrSky ACCST control link. ACCST receivers are not too expensive. The relatively full-featured RXSR comes in at about $20. The less full-featured XM Plus comes in at about $15. If we scroll down in this product page, we start to see one of the main downsides of FrSky ACCST and any FrSky protocol. And that is that FrSky has turned their firmware ecosystem into just a real morass. It's really hard to know which firmware is on your receiver and whether that firmware will actually bind to your controller. And this isn't the video to go into all those details, but suffice it to say that if you get a FrSky receiver, there's a fair chance that it won't bind straight out of the box and that you'll need to flash a different firmware to it in order to get it to bind with your controller. And figuring out what firmware that is can be a bit of a hassle. There certainly are people out there who have figured out, who've navigated this maze and have no trouble with it. But there are certainly a lot of other people out there, especially beginners, who find it really freaking frustrating. In addition, flashing the FrSky receivers is a little bit tedious. You have to plug the receiver into the radio and put the firmware on the radio's SD card and then flash it. And for some receivers, that's not a big deal. The radio has a little port on the bottom, and for the RXSR receiver we were just looking at, it has a plug that you can just unplug it from your quad, plug it into the radio, and be good to go. But for other receivers that are soldered directly to the flight controller, you can't just unplug them to flash them. It's a little bit of a hassle. There is a better way to handle firmware updates that we'll look at when we get to some of the other protocols. And you'll see why. I'm like, well, how else would you do it? You'll see. Another characteristic that we're going to talk about in this video is the latency of the control link. Latency is how long it takes from the moment you move the stick to the moment the receiver spits that out to the flight controller. And obviously lower latency is better. Higher latency makes it harder to fly. ACCST has acceptably low latency. People were flying it for a long time, but receiver protocols have come a long way since then, and it's actually one of the highest latency control links that we're going to see in this roundup. So although it's the worst, it's still good enough, especially if you're just a beginner and just starting out. In order to close out this section, let's ask the question, who should buy FrSky ACCST and who should avoid FrSky ACCST? The person who should buy FrSky ACCST is usually going to be a beginner. If you've bought your first radio and it happens to have ACCST in it, at which there's a fair chance that it does, then that's what you're going to use just because that's the radio you purchased. Especially if you're on a budget, FrSky ACCST is a great choice. The receivers are pretty inexpensive and there are lots of inexpensive radios that also support it. In addition, most, if not all, of the bind and fly quads that a beginner might want to buy, all the way down to tiny whoops and up to much bigger ones, they're all going to be available with ACCST receivers, and they'll be good to go. The person who should avoid ACCST is basically anybody who has the budget to get something better. Because all of the other control links we're going to talk about in this video are better than ACCST in many ways, but they also cost more money. So let's go on to the next one. And the next protocol we're going to talk about is the successor to ACCST, FrSky ACCESS. ACCESS involves certain performance enhancements, such as lower latency control link, but the performance of ACCESS is in many ways the same as the performance of ACCST. The range of ACCESS receivers is about the same, roughly 1 to 2 kilometers under ideal conditions, and somewhat less than that when there are obstacles in the way. One of the features that ACCESS offers is over-the-air firmware updates. What that means is that the radio will send new firmware to the receiver wirelessly. You never need to plug the receiver into the radio or into your computer in order to update the firmware. And don't underestimate what a big deal this is. All of the modules we're going to talk about going forward support over-the-air firmware updates. Now, FrSky ACCESS has some other quality of life improvements related to the way that receivers are bound and registered, but for the most part, FrSky ACCESS is just a slightly higher performance version of ACCST with over-the-air firmware updates. And if that was all it would still be a compelling upgrade. But FrSky ACCESS is only available in FrSky radios. It is not available in any third-party radio. So you are going to be locking yourself into the FrSky ecosystem if you decide to go this direction. So that brings us to the end of this section. Who should get it and who should avoid it? And basically, who should get it is the same person we talked about in the previous section. If you have just settled on a FrSky ACCESS radio as the one that you want to have, then you may as well use it. And I recommend that you use the FrSky Archer line of receivers, which come with ACCESS firmware pre-installed and are designed to work with the latest features coming out for ACCESS. Some of the older receivers can run ACCESS firmware, but they're not the latest and greatest. But who should avoid it? Well, like I said, one of the downsides is that it only works on FrSky radios. So if you have got a Radio Master or a Jumper radio, or any radio that isn't a FrSky radio, you're not going to be using ACCESS. You're going to be using something else. Now, locking yourself into a FrSky radio isn't such a bad thing. FrSky makes really good radios. But it must be pointed out that FrSky has been actively antagonistic to third-party modules like TBS Crossfire, doing things like changing a chip on the QX7 to intentionally break compatibility with Crossfire and making users who want to use Crossfire with the QX7 open up their radio and take a soldering iron to it to remove the chip and replace it with one that works like it originally did. FrSky also ships all of their radios with support for Crossfire removed, even though that support is baked into the firmware of the radios and they actively take it out. And if you want to use Crossfire, you can just flash the right firmware. But FrSky has demonstrated that they will inconvenience their users in order to prevent them from using third-party modules. So if you ever think that you might want to upgrade to one of these third-party modules, and chances are that you will, we'll talk about that next, then you might want to think twice about committing to a FrSky radio. But they are good radios. Hey there folks, Joshua from the future here. I have a quick addition I need to make that relates to if you fly a lot of fixed-wing planes with servos. And I just didn't think of this when I was originally recording this video because I just don't do that. If you fly fixed-wing planes with servos and you don't use a flight controller, in other words, you plug your servos directly into your receiver, then the FrSky ACCESS and specifically the FrSky Archer line of receivers has a lot to offer you. For example, right now we're looking at a 10-channel PWM-capable receiver that has XT30 plugs, so you could have redundant power for your receiver, I guess. And it's even got stabilization, gyro stabilization built in. No flight controller, it's just built into the receiver. There is a ton of variety in the PWM-capable servo-focused receivers in the Archer line and also in the FrSky ACCST. Those receivers are slowly being phased out, but there's still a ton of them. In fact, arguably there is more variety in PWM-capable receivers in the FrSky ACCESS and the FrSky Archer line. And if that's really where you're focused, then why are you watching my channel? I don't talk about any of that stuff, but it deserves to be pointed out. Next set of control links that we're going to talk about are long-range control links. And that means that they go not just 1 to 2 kilometers, but 10, 20, 50, maybe 100 kilometers, or maybe more. And if you're thinking, oh, I'm never going to go 10 kilometers, I barely leave my yard, there's still a really compelling reason to think about getting one of these modules. First of all, they'll go 10, 20, 30 kilometers under ideal conditions. But maybe if you're in a concrete bando, you'll still have the advantage of knowing that it's going to be very, very difficult to fail safe. 100 kilometers range in open space might be 3 or 4 concrete walls in a bando, but that's still going to allow you to fly basically until you're guaranteed to lose video. That's what you get with these higher performance control links. You basically never think about fail-safing. You only think about outrunning your video. These high-performance control links have other convenience features and performance features that we will talk about, but that's the main reason to choose them. And the first one we're going to talk about is FrSky R9. FrSky R9 runs in the 900 megahertz frequency band. That's one of the reasons why it has such great range. It also has pretty high output power, 1 watt. Like with other FrSky stuff, FrSky R9 is really reasonably priced. $20 for a receiver. That's the same price as the 2.4 gigahertz ACCST receiver. And the module is about $50, cheaper than any other of the other long-range options we're going to see in this roundup. The downside of FrSky R9 is basically the same as the downsides we've talked about with the other FrSky protocols. The FrSky R9 ACCESS module only works with FrSky radios. You cannot put it into the back of a third-party radio like this Radio Master. Well, you can put it in there, but the software won't support it. It won't be able to use it. It only works with FrSky radios, so you're sort of locked in there. But hey, FrSky makes good radios, so maybe you're okay with that. The firmware hassle of knowing which firmware you've got and flashing to the correct firmware is the same as with the others. People trying to bind their FrSky R9 receivers, sometimes it won't work and they don't really know why. So who should buy FrSky R9? Well, the main person is going to be someone who already owns a FrSky radio and is looking to graduate to long-range control link. It's going to work with your existing radio. It's not going to be too expensive. And another advantage of R9 is there's another firmware you can put on your R9 hardware called ExpressLRS. We're going to talk about that later as well. It is very high performance, open source, and it works with any radio. And some people are buying R9 hardware not because they want to run R9, but because they want to run ExpressLRS. So if you think you might be interested in ExpressLRS, you might be picking up R9 hardware today. Who should avoid R9? Well, anyone who doesn't own a FrSky radio should stay away from R9. The ACCESS version of the R9 module only works with FrSky radios, and that's the one that you're going to probably be buying if you buy today. In addition, the other systems we're going to talk about, Crossfire, Tracer, Ghost, and ExpressLRS, are much, much easier to manage and live with. And it's hard to go into details about that here in this video, which is already packed full of a lot of information, but just suffice it to say the basic things you do on a day-to-day basis: binding the receiver, managing multiple receivers, updating firmware, that kind of livability things. They're just much easier and better thought out on the other protocols we're going to talk about. The next one we're going to talk about is TBS Crossfire. TBS Crossfire is also a 900 megahertz control link, and it has up to 2 watts of output power on some of the modules. This one that I'm holding here only goes up to 1 watt, and some of the other radios might max out at 250 milliwatts or 500 milliwatts. What does that translate to in terms of range? At 2 watts, a 900 megahertz Crossfire module will go like easily 100 kilometers, maybe more, in open air. It is more range than almost anybody is ever going to need, because you're going to outrun your video. Do you have a video link that'll go 100 kilometers? No. So it's more range. It basically means you'll never fail safe. Now, that's true all the way down to the 250 milliwatt version as well. Crossfire has basically as much range as you could possibly want. That's true for FrSky R9 as well, just to be fair. Crossfire is extremely easy to manage. You're looking right here at the TBS Agent X program, which is used to configure and update firmware on TBS devices. It's very simple and intuitive, or well, intuitive if you've got a little bit of experience with this stuff, and it's probably the state of the art in terms of managing these modules. Crossfire is the most mature of any of the long-range control links that we're going to talk about. Some of the others have higher performance in some ways, but they're relatively new and may still have some bugs or quirks or performance issues being shaken out. Crossfire has been around for several years, and it's basically guaranteed that it's stable, solid, good performance, and not going to have any surprises for you. Another advantage of Crossfire is it is basically the only one of the long-range control links that you can buy bind and fly quads with a Crossfire receiver pre-installed. The others just aren't popular enough to really drive bind and fly manufacturers to include them. What are the downsides of Crossfire? One of them is the size of the antennas. And this is actually true for FrSky R9 and all other 900 megahertz control links as well. The antennas are pretty big, and mounting them on the quad can require a little bit more thought than the smaller 2.4 gigahertz antennas. It's also much more likely that the antenna is going to get beat up and chopped up, and it's just a little bit more cumbersome to deal with. This isn't a deal breaker, and many Crossfire pilots deal with it, but it is certainly something worth mentioning. Another quirk of the 900 megahertz frequency band is that it's much smaller than the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band used by some of the other modules. And that means that you can't get as many pilots in the air at the same time without risking failsafes or control link interruptions, micro failsafes. When you're flying 2.4 gigahertz, you can literally have 25, 30, 40, maybe even 50 pilots in the air at the same time, all flying, all with basically perfect control links. But with a 900 megahertz control link like Crossfire, once you start getting above 4, 6, maybe 8 pilots in the air at a time, you really have to start thinking about interference between them. Crossfire even has a race-specific set of settings, which minimizes the probability of interference. You don't see that in the 2.4 gigahertz control links. You just don't think about interference. And this is especially true if you're in the EU. The EU uses the 868 megahertz frequency band, which is even smaller than the 915 megahertz band used in the USA and much of the rest of the world. And in the EU especially, if you're trying to run a race with like 5 or 8 pilots in the air at the same time, avoiding micro failsafes is really difficult. So who should buy Crossfire? A typical fun flyer or freestyle pilot who basically wants to never think about range or failsafe, Crossfire is a great choice. Racers and freestyle pilots who want the lowest possible latency should be looking at other control links. Crossfire has great latency, but it's not the state of the art anymore in terms of low latency. If you want to be 100% sure you're buying a mature and well-tested system that just works without surprise bugs or performance issues, Crossfire is the one for you. Who should avoid Crossfire? If you live in the EU and you fly in groups, especially racing pilots who often fly in large groups and need the best performance you can't tolerate micro failsafes at all, you're going to want to stay away from Crossfire. There are better options today. Also, people who want to be on the cutting edge of development and new features, Crossfire is not getting as much updates today as some of the other protocols that are newer. It's still pretty solid, but it's not on the cutting edge in the way that it used to be. The next control link we're going to look at is ImmersionRC Ghost. And one thing that makes ImmersionRC Ghost stand out is that it operates in the 2.4 gigahertz band. That's the same as the FrSky ACCESS and ACCST. But those guys had about 1 to 2 kilometers of range, whereas ImmersionRC Ghost has, well, it's actually a little hard to pin down. See, Ghost has multiple different modes it can operate in. There's a normal mode, there's a long range mode, there's a racing mode, there's a what they call a pure race mode. And each of these modes makes a different decision about controlling latency versus controlling range. So the long range mode can go, well, theoretically it can go 60 or 70 kilometers. And I don't know anybody who's tested it out to that far, but it can go basically as far as you ever would need, but it has a much slower refresh rate and higher latency. The racing mode has 250 hertz update rate, like something like 4 to 6 milliseconds, I think is the latency, but it has much shorter range. So one of the advantages of Ghost is that it lets you decide what balance of performance versus range that you want. But there's no question that on the normal mode, it's still more range than most people are ever going to need. Downsides of Ghost. Ghost is still really new. In fact, at the time I'm making this video, support for Ghost protocol has not yet been added to Betaflight. Ghost is still usable by using other pre-existing protocols, but that just shows you how new it is. Another limitation of the Ghost module is its output power. It only outputs up to 350 milliwatts. And because it's using some fairly advanced technology, it can still get amazing range with that small output power. But there's no question that a 900 megahertz Crossfire module pushing 1 watt is going to get more range and penetration than a Ghost module at 350 milliwatts, no matter how much wizardry the Ghost module claims to pack. I think Ghost is perfect for a person who wants to fly long range 20 kilometers one day and low latency 250 hertz update rate at a race the next day. The great thing about Ghost is that you have the freedom to choose the balance between range and latency. Ghost also has smaller 2.4 gigahertz antennas. They're significantly smaller than the 900 megahertz antennas used by Crossfire, so they're easier to mount, they're more durable, and less likely to take damage. In addition, Ghost's receivers are actually really tiny. There's a really tiny receiver, they call it the Zepto is the model name, and it's one of the smallest, lightest receivers that you could get. Great for tiny quads like tiny whoops. The next module we're going to look at is TBS Tracer. And TBS Tracer was TBS's answer to ImmersionRC Ghost. Like Ghost, Tracer operates in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band, and that means that the Crossfire issues with having too many pilots in the air interfering with each other are gone. You can get a lot of pilots in the air with TBS Tracer and Ghost without having any interference issues. The advantage of Tracer compared to Ghost is that it has the same interface as Crossfire. So all the nice things I said about firmware management and configuration and just ease of use that I said about Crossfire, those all also apply to Tracer. In addition, if you are an existing Crossfire pilot and you're thinking of switching to Tracer, there's basically going to be no learning curve. Everything works the same as it did. In fact, Tracer receivers have the same pin layout as Crossfire receivers. So if there's an accessory out there that was made to work with a Crossfire receiver, it will also work with a Tracer receiver. Support for Tracer in Betaflight and any other flight controller. Tracer just outputs the Crossfire protocol to the flight controller, so any flight controller that supports Crossfire can also support Tracer. Downsides of Tracer. Tracer only supports one modulation type and frame rate. the idea of Tracer is that it's focused on racers who want the lowest possible latency and who don't care too much about range. But compared to Ghost, Ghost supports the exact same modulation and frame rate that Tracer supports, and a whole bunch others. Whereas Tracer is just for racers. Oh, it rhymes. Tracer is just for racers. Tracer can have adequate range. It has several, I think 25 milliwatts, 100 milliwatts, and ludicrous power, which is somewhere around 1 watt. They haven't said the actual amount. And on 100 milliwatts, Tracer gets a few kilometers of range. Not really impressive, but enough. But if you're like in a bando, it might fail safe. Whereas on ludicrous power, it's been tested out to about 20 kilometers in open space, which puts it in the range of probably more range than most people are ever going to need. But it's needing to pull a lot of power from your radio's battery in order to get that range. And it's going to cause additional interference. If you have a bunch of people running Tracer at 1 watt all in the same area, you're going to have increased probability of micro failsafes and other problems. Whereas if you're using something like Ghost, you're not going to have that because it's basically making more efficient use of the spectrum. Who should buy TBS Tracer? Anybody who's focused on racing and who wants the lowest possible latency. Tracer is not technically the lowest possible latency, but it's pretty low. And if you're focused on racing, then Tracer may be a good choice for you, especially because Crossfire is so ingrained into the culture of racing that by going with Tracer instead of Ghost, you're gonna have a little bit less of a learning curve and a culture shock. A freestyle pilot who cares more about latency and less about range might also choose Tracer. For example, Mr. Steele has famously endorsed Tracer. And for someone with his kind of twitchy, reflex-oriented flight style, the latency of Tracer really helps him out. If you're a current Crossfire user who wants to get the lower latency, but wants to stay in the TBS ecosystem, or maybe wants to move to 2.4 gigahertz because you're a European and you're sick of getting micro failsafes all the time, Tracer might be a good choice for you. Who should avoid Tracer? Who should stay away? If you want the maximum range and penetration, Tracer isn't it. Ghost is going to beat it for range penetration, Crossfire is going to beat it for range and penetration, and ExpressLRS, which we're going to talk about next, will beat it for range and penetration. Ghost is especially compelling compared to Tracer if you want the flexibility to switch between low latency and long range, which Tracer doesn't offer you. Finally, we're going to talk about ExpressLRS, and in order to do that, I'm going to hold back up this FrSky R9 module. ExpressLRS is an open source project designed to get just the maximum performance you can get out of a control link. And it actually breaks this formula. See, normally there's a trade-off you have to make between long range and low latency. But ExpressLRS manages to get both long range and low latency at the same time. And it does that by making more efficient use of the data that it sends. Hey there folks, Joshua from the future here. I want to clarify what I mean when I say that ExpressLRS has arguably the best range and latency of any control link. And in order to do that, I'm going to put up this video here from Wesley Varty. There's his handsome face. He is doing some amazing work range testing all these control links, flying 30, 40 kilometers, really doing it. I'll put a link to his channel down in the video description. Kudos to him. ExpressLRS at 900 megahertz has a maximum packet rate of 250 hertz, which then relates to its latency. But there are other receivers out there that can do 250 hertz. Ghost does it, Tracer does it. The reason I say that ExpressLRS has the best range and latency is that ExpressLRS, as we see him here, he's going on 100 milliwatts at 250 hertz, he's going 33 kilometers, and he didn't even fail safe. He just had to turn around because his battery was dead. Tracer can do 250 hertz, but it'll only go like 20 kilometers on 1+ watt. So ExpressLRS has the best combination of range and latency. For any given latency, it will have more range, even though other things might have better latency under some other conditions. Or equal latency under some other conditions. ExpressLRS is also just being driven by this open source idea. It's not a commercial product. And these guys are just like, what can we do next? And then they release new firmware and you try it out. And if you're really excited about open source development, you just like being in that environment, then that's going to be very appealing to you. They've come up with some really cool things. Like, for example, when you flash an ExpressLRS module and an ExpressLRS receiver, you type a passphrase in, kind of like your Wi-Fi password, and then they're just automatically bound based on that passphrase. You never have to hit the bind button. That's pretty freaking cool. You can hit the bind button. There is one if you want one. That's just an example of a cool feature that the ExpressLRS devs have come up with that I haven't seen before. Maybe we'll see other people adopting it later. Downsides of ExpressLRS: it has gotten easier to set up than it used to be. It used to be that in order to get ExpressLRS running, you had to solder up an ST-Link adapter to your module, your receiver. It was a bit of a pain to flash. You had to manually compile the firmware yourself. You don't have to do any of that anymore. Flashing firmware can be done through your radio's SD card or through Betaflight pass-through, and there's an app, just like an app that you download and install, called the ExpressLRS Configurator, that handles all of the compiling and creating of the firmware files. That being said, it is still more difficult to set up and use than Crossfire, Tracer, and Ghost, which are a little bit more polished commercial products. Now, for most people who are in the FPV hobby, if you can flash your radio, if you can flash a FrSky receiver, you're going to have no trouble flashing ExpressLRS. But it has to be mentioned that for an absolute beginner who is just struggling to get their frickin' receiver bound and their OpenTX radio set up, this may be a little bit more of a hurdle than they may want to go through. The other downside is that no bind and fly quads come with ExpressLRS yet, but I am sure that that is going to change because ExpressLRS has great performance, great range, and it is open source. So anybody can make an ExpressLRS receiver, and I feel pretty confident that we're going to see bind and flies with ExpressLRS in it as ExpressLRS continues to get more popular, which I'm also confident is going to happen. It is worth pointing out that companies have just started selling pre-made ExpressLRS modules and receivers. This one from Banggood is made by Happymodel, and it would save you the trouble of buying FrSky R9 hardware and flashing it. And there's actually more of these coming, so that objection may get removed. So who should get ExpressLRS? And this is a tough one to answer because in some ways, ExpressLRS just beats or matches everybody else in here in terms of range, penetration, latency, and price. It comes out ahead. So maybe we should ask the question, who should not get ExpressLRS? And like I said, the main reason that you would want to avoid ExpressLRS is if you don't want the slightly higher technical challenge of getting it going, if you want a paid customer service instead of a bunch of really helpful people on the Discord server, and they are really helpful. In fact, some of them objected to the first version of this video where I said where I implied that paid customer service was superior to a bunch of helpful enthusiasts on the Discord. In fact, many of them feel that helpful enthusiasts are preferable to paid customer service. That's up to you to decide, but they are all volunteers, and that is what it is. Or if you're just looking for a mature, polished commercial product that's refined for end users, ExpressLRS is very much an enthusiast product. It moves quickly. Things are constantly changing. They're not always easy, and you kind of need to keep up with it like any open source project, as opposed to having it be a little bit more pre-digested and easy to use. Finally, I want to briefly mention that ExpressLRS also comes in a 2.4 gigahertz version. Basically, everything about it is the same, except instead of flashing it to a 900 megahertz radio, you would flash it to a 2.4 gigahertz radio. This gives you all of the advantages of 2.4 gigahertz that you see with Ghost and Tracer, including smaller antennas and less interference between pilots. ExpressLRS in 2.4 gigahertz has the lowest latency of any control link I'm aware of today, with a 500 hertz packet rate. Everybody else tops out at, I think, 250. Ghost may have one receiver that's supposed to do 500 hertz, actually. I take that back. And it gets extraordinary range, especially when compared to other 2.4 gigahertz devices. Wesley Vardy, as I mentioned earlier, tested ExpressLRS 2.4 gigahertz out to 33 kilometers at 100 milliwatts, which is that's just amazing compared to Tracer at 1 watt. Tracer went like 22 kilometers, so just extraordinary. The downside currently is that 2.4 gigahertz ExpressLRS has very limited hardware support. You can flash it to ImmersionRC Ghost, but it requires an ST-Link programmer, and you cannot flash back to Ghost after you make that step. You can also self-build yourself by soldering up parts to a board and build your own, and that's what I think most people who are doing this are doing. But Happymodel just announced on Facebook like 3 days ago that they were doing a run of 2.4 gigahertz ExpressLRS receivers, so this is coming. And in fact, I think most of the ExpressLRS community feels like 2.4 gigahertz is where you want to be. But for the time being, I think most people are on 900 megahertz. Anyway, that's the situation as I understand it. And that is going to bring us to the end of the video. I hope you've got a better idea now of which of these is the right one for you. Whichever one you decide you want to get, there are links down in the video description. They are affiliate links. And what that means is that if you click that link and then you make any purchase at the affiliated vendor, I get a small commission. So you're going to pick up TBS Tracer, ImmersionRC Ghost, TBS Crossfire, FrSky R9, whatever you want to pick up, or anything else. Click the link, make a purchase, I get a commission. It's an easy way for you to support the channel. It doesn't cost you anything. If you still have questions that you feel like weren't answered, go ahead and leave a comment down below, or just reach out to me. My email inbox is always open, and I will do my best to help you with whatever questions you have. That's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching. Happy flying. What are you doing in here? The least you could do is subscribe or join my Patreon, or like just here's another video I picked out for you. Jeez.